Karen Testerman, I want to thank you not for spending just a few minutes with Granite Grok, but now 2 hours with Granite Grok as we do the next Grok Gauntlet, because you're running for
Governor of New Hampshire.
Yep. So you have 3 primary opponents: Governor Sununu, Thad Riley, Julian Assad.
Correct.
So
maybe even a couple more, I think. I don't know.
well,
they're nominals.
Right.
yeah,
Yes.
and I've not heard of them, and they haven't approached me. So.
Right.
Everybody else has. So, the purpose of the Grok Gauntlet, the ground rules are, he and I are going to bounce questions off of you, usually a question with a follow-up, and then we'll just keep going round and round and round. And hopefully ask you questions that you'll know a lot of them, but we don't expect all of them. The purpose of the cameras is twofold now. One is so that all the other Groksters who couldn't be here tonight, I will take the video, put it up on YouTube as a private video, and then they can see that to see if we are going to give an endorsement in this race. As you know, Granite Grok is extremely few endorsements in any particular cycle. What happens is that everybody will vote when we've completed all of the interviews for a particular race. You happen to be, because of the scheduling conflict before, you were going to be the first governor candidate. Unfortunately, it's turned out that you're the last candidate. So I will be calling the roll, asking for whether or not we will give an endorsement, and if so, who that will be. And once we do that, I will be making all the videos public so that our readership who have asked for this can see all the various candidates to see how did they handle Skip and Mike and Norm and everybody else. How did they react under pressure, and what's the knowledge level? So I will tell you that there's a large range of knowledge level here that we have now seen.
I've only participated in one other gubernatorial candidate's gauntlet. I was not. You did ACR, did you?
Yes, we did.
Okay, I did. I was not there, but I did we had the Riley thing here, so I did the Riley thing as well.
Okay.
So. Yeah.
So let us begin.
Okay.
My favorite question, or my favorite phrase on Granite Grok, and it's very wide-ranging, is what is the proper role of government? And there is a very specific answer I'm hoping to hear, but there's certainly a range of answers. So for you at the state level, what is the proper role of government concerning the government and its citizens?
It's supposed to protect the rights of the citizen. And the real role of government basically is to make sure that trade can go on, businesses can go on, to make sure there's infrastructure, to travel back and forth and across state lines, and to work with other states on that, and to protect the citizens of the state.
Okay. Your turn.
Well, my hypotheticals will deal with if you were elected,
Okay.
mostly. If you were the governor, would you be support or be in favor of mask mandates?
I object to mask mandates. They're not law, and the governor's role is to enforce law, and it's up to each individual citizen to decide what it is that they are going to do for
How
themselves.
about vaccine mandates?
Same answer. It's up to the individual. There's no one size fits all in vaccines, and everybody must assess what's best for their own family, what's best for their own situation, what's best for their body.
One more follow-up.
One more follow-up. The governor, the sitting governor, declared states of emergency and then rolled them over and rolled them over and rolled them over. And apparently, my understanding is that he indicated that he was going to categorize certain types of businesses and organizations as essential and some as non-essential. So my understanding is, for example, state liquor stores were deemed to be essential and could stay open, but churches and synagogues, religious organizations, were not essential and were supposed to be closed. That's my understanding. Would that be something that, if you were governor, you would have instituted?
Absolutely not, because a governor's role is to enforce the Constitution. He takes the vow or an oath of office to support the state constitution. And it does not say that he's supposed to be in any way restricting the people. It's individual responsibility. Additionally, we have a public health officer, and it appears that the current governor just rolled over the responsibilities of that person. And the only thing that they can do in reality is to go to an individual and say, we think that you might be contagious, therefore we are asking you to quarantine yourself, not the whole state.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. As you well know, there were a number of really precedent and overriding decisions made by the U.S. Supreme Court. The one that would apply to New Hampshire, probably the quickest, is West Virginia versus EPA. So I'm going to assume for the question that you know what that is, and how would that affect the way that you would act vis-a-vis the legislative body and you as the chief of the executive branch?
So one of the things that the governor is supposed to do is to enforce any laws and enforce the Constitution. And when they realize that something is unconstitutional, then they are supposed to work with the legislature to actually not enforce those laws. And anything that is any policy that the agencies might want to set forth, then the governor is supposed to actually deny those policies.
Okay, follow-up. We have this institute called JLCAR, in which legislators from both chambers meet with unaccountable, unelected, and unassailable bureaucrats to approve or disapprove of regulations stemming from law. And my hold is that if regulators have to create more regulations, the legislature hasn't done its job completely. And I consider the complaint that, well, we have to deal with 1,000 bills a year completely baseless. Either you're doing your job right or you're not doing it at all. If you found that a bill was sent to you and your staff said, well, we don't understand what this is, or this is how we would implement it, would you immediately say, that's not our job, and send it back to the legislators and say, do your job?
Oh, the answer is yes. And the other thing is that the legislature, very first question they should be asking before they propose any bill at all is, does the Constitution allow us to do this?
Okay. Okay, that's the constitutional part. How would you handle, sorry for the second follow-up, but how would you handle the legislators, probably the leadership that said, no, we've got to move on to other stuff?
Well, they have a role, and I have a role as a governor. And I would just simply, they can go ahead and propose it. If they passed it and it comes up to my desk, I'm not going to veto. I'm not going to sign it. I would most likely veto it, because if it's non-constitutional, then it shouldn't be there in the first place.
All right.
Well, I'd like to go into that a little bit more. The history of the rise of the so-called administrative state, federally and in state government, goes back to the Roosevelt administration, in efforts of the Roosevelt administration supposedly to get the government to pull us out of a depression. And originally, the first Supreme Court case that came up actually said, you can't do things that you basically have wanted agencies, administrative agencies, to do, and that led to attempts at packing the Supreme Court, which were unsuccessful. However, there is a saying that the members of the Supreme Court read the newspapers and read the political polls, and so when the packing attempt was made, all of a sudden subsequent challenges to the rise of the administrative state basically were, they let the administrative state go crazy and continue to make rules. And so in the federal system, there is an Administrative Procedures Act which requires proposed rules to be published in the Federal Register for a comment, and then they have public hearings, and eventually they're adopted and they appear in the Code of Federal Regulations, but they're still subject to being challenged in court. New Hampshire has a similar process. It does have an Administrative Procedure Act. It does have a place where proposed rules, but they're dealt with by this JLCAR thing in the legislature. The problem appears, and I think as I don't want to speak for Skip, he can speak for himself. The problem appears to be that when legislation is passed by the general court, which does not fully address all the nooks and crannies of a particular issue they're trying to address by legislation, they say, well, we'll let the agency do it by rule. And that's what happens. And so then you get these unelected bureaucrats proposing these rules. And I've heard proposals to eliminate JLCAR. I've heard, but basically, at some point, someone has to say, and maybe it's the governor's place to say, when you get legislation that is not fully formed and easily understandable, that this is what the law says and this is what you must do or must not do, and doesn't leave open a lot of areas for discretionary action by an agency, it seems to me that the governor needs to say, no, that's not acceptable, I'm going to veto this thing. Would you agree with that proposition?
I do agree with it, and the problem with JLCAR is that they just rubber stamp anything that comes out from the agencies, which is wrong. And the other thing that's wrong with most legislation is that there's no teeth in it if you don't follow the legislation. So for a prime example is in our schools, it says that you shall teach the Constitution, history, civics, both constitutions, and the Declaration of Independence. And then you shall test and you shall report to the Department of Education. It's not being done. So what's the consequence?
Well,
there's no consequence. So this is a problem within legislation itself as well. And this is something that I plan to be very active in turning around and saying, if there's no consequence for not following this law, I'll send it back to the legislature and tell them that they need to create the proper consequence for not following the law.
Okay.
There's got to be teeth in it somehow.
Tell me when I can continue. I've got all sorts of stuff rolling around.
Let me take a whack.
Okay.
Obviously, we've got gun stock going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the controversy is, should the county own a ski area? It's also been said by me that I don't think the state should own a ski area as well. Where the delineation is, for me, government should not be duplicating the efforts of what the private sector can do, mostly because they're inefficient at doing it. It costs people more, and the wrong things get subsidized. I would like your opinion on that statement, that if the private sector should do something, it should, and then the government should not. And you can range that all the way down to the town level, all the way up to the federal government, if you wish.
Correct. So my opinion has been a long one. I think if you remember Diane Gilbert with it was the New Hampshire Center for Constitutional Studies, which I helped to establish, often said that it's the people's property. People are supposed to own the property. Government is not supposed to own the property. There's special places, military bases, obviously. Obviously, the State House sits on a piece of property, and the State House government is responsible for taking care of that, maintaining it, etc. But as far as where private industry is concerned, that's one of the things that we need to ask in our proposed legislation. In addition to, is it constitutional? Is this something that the private sector should be doing. And if it is, then it should be hands-off for the government.
Okay.
If you were elected governor and you were then seeking a new term, or even now as you're running, would you accept money for campaign contributions from any public body?
No, my contributions are all coming from individuals, and there's no large company, no pharmaceuticals, no electrical company, no, none of this is making any major contribution to me. They know I can't be bought.
Yeah. By the way, there is something beeping in the background.
Yeah, that's to remind you to take some pills.
Ah.
Okay. I'll ask 2 quick questions and then I'll go take my pills. Right now, the Attorney General of the state is appointed by the governor and has to be confirmed by at least 3 members of the Executive Council. 39 states in the country have direct election of their Attorney Generals. Would you favor a constitutional amendment for New Hampshire's Constitution to provide for the direct election of the Attorney General?
Absolutely.
I'm going to excuse myself for a moment.
Okay. All right, just you and me, Karen, for a couple of minutes. When you mentioned about private versus public, where would parks fall into that? You know, we have a number of federal recreational areas for camping and things like that. We have a number of state parks. Would that continue under your leadership? Subject to whatever the law is that established that, as we have seen with Gunstock.
Right. Well, so I really don't think that. I think there's some places, St. Gaudens, for example, is a federal national park. And it's there to preserve the area and to the history. So that, in order to operate and so forth, would be up to the federal government to fund and so forth. And that's fine if they're going to do that. But when you're getting into a ski resort, when you're getting into even little liquor stores, I question whether or not government should be involved in that, because those are private things that the private, not private, but the free market should be overruling. People have a right to own those businesses and to make the profit, and it shouldn't be necessarily the government's role to do that.
Okay. Next question is strings attached.
Favorite subject.
Because I have asked others, I will ask, what percentage of the state of New Hampshire's budget is federally supplied?
I understand that about 50% of it is. I understand that the ownership of the Department of Education is even higher. And the problem that we have with teaching CRT and SEL and notifying parents is tied up in the fact that we are accepting so much federal funds, and those strings are dictating to our local schools what can be taught, what should be done, what their practices are.
Okay. The big reason why I asked the question, and this is my follow-up, is that we had that big controversy when people started showing up at the Executive Council meetings, when it came time for receiving money from the federal government concerning vaccines for the pandemic. And we certainly at Granite Rock put up the information that it would essentially be handing over our sovereignty by contract. You've been here long enough to remember that there was a time when the federal government wanted to pay, I think the amount was like $3.69 or something like that per person, to force us all to wear seatbelts. This was even more strings attached, in that in receipt of those millions of dollars, that we would cede our sovereignty over to the federal government regardless of what, and I'm just going to put it straight out, Governor Sununu's lackey of an attorney general saying, "Oh, it's fine, it's fine." It's like attorney All right, I'm going to get it wrong again.
Livernois.
Not really stating all of RSA 91A concerning the illegal Belknap County delegation meeting that was held earlier this week. Picking and choosing. So the question is, if you saw such information from the feds that are willing to help you with the budget, but said, well, yeah, we'll give you this money, but we need these things from you other than strict accounting of how the money is spent. You know, audits are important, but what if they kind of snuck in other things? What would you do?
I'd reject it. I mean, the reality is the role of the governor is to protect the sovereignty of the state of New Hampshire, and the citizens in the follow-up of that. So here we have a situation where we're having illegal immigrants coming into the state, getting all kinds of benefits, and yet we have citizens who are being told that now their medications are costing them a lot of money, insurance isn't covering it, and yet we've got illegal people coming into this state and being fostered, and they get unemployment, they get medical care, they get rent forgiveness, all kinds of things are going on. But the citizens of New Hampshire are suffering. That's wrong. We need to flip it around and actually put those people back on the bus and send them back to Washington, D.C. or down to Delaware or back to Mexico or wherever it is they came from.
Sort of sounds like a couple of other states that are doing that right now. Go ahead, Norm.
Well, the Constitution of New Hampshire has a section 28A, which appears to prohibit unfunded mandates. In other words, that the state cannot tell lower levels of government to do things that might cost money without providing the funds for doing so. Yet, many times the legislature passes laws or rules are adopted which constitute mandates for the lower levels of government, and that does not get accompanied by funding per se. So if faced with any kind of, whether it's a legislation or a rule that you might have the power to reject, or a legislation you would have the power to veto, that would be an unfunded mandate, what would be your position about those?
Well, actually, the legislature should be held responsible, but I intend to have someone actually in my office who is a constitutionalist, who knows and understands the New Hampshire Constitution and can give me advice on whether or not something abides by the Constitution. If it doesn't abide by the Constitution, I just have to send it back to the legislature and tell them no.
Okay. In our Constitution, our state Constitution, we do not have any provision by which any public official, public office holder, elected or appointed, can be removed by petition recall, citizen petition recall, as they have in, for example, California, where they recall the governor, state Supreme Court justices, and just recently the prosecuting attorney in San Francisco. We don't have that provision in New Hampshire. The only way that an official can be removed in New Hampshire is by an impeachment process, where bills of impeachment have to be passed by the House of Representatives, and then there's a trial at the Senate. And in the history of our state, among judges at least, since the beginning of New Hampshire, there have been 2 impeachment actions brought against judges, one of which in the 1700s, which was dropped, the other in the more recent modern history, in which the bills of impeachment were passed by the House of Representatives, but the accused judge was acquitted in the trial in the Senate.
Correct.
So impeachment as a mechanism for removal does not seem to work very well. It certainly it's very difficult to do, and essentially it definitely leaves a lot of the citizenry without recourse. There has been proposed in the last legislative session a constitutional amendment that would provide for the citizen petition recall of state court judges only. It only dealt with state court judges, not with everyone. The reason it wasn't apply to everyone is because most everyone is elected on 2-year cycles, so it's pretty quick to get them out. But judges, once again, when a judge is appointed, very much like the Attorney General, judge is appointed by the governor, confirmed by at least 3 members of the Executive Council, 4 people, and now that judge serves until they either resign or die or hit age 70.
Correct.
So they can be in there for a very long time without much recourse by the citizenry. So there was a constitutional amendment that would provide for citizen petition recalls. That did not get much support in the House of Representatives, certainly not the requisite number to even send it to the Senate. Would you favor a petition recall mechanism available for whether state court judges or other officials?
Well, the governor could only, in that particular case, could only use the bully pulpit to go one way or the other and encourage the citizenry, because the amendment process is only provided for by the House has to pass it, the Senate has to pass it, but it doesn't come to the governor governor.
It goes to them. It goes on the ballot.
It goes on the ballot,
Right.
but the governor really doesn't have any say in it.
Except to encourage or discourage.
Exactly, to use the
So if something like that were to
vote.
pass the House and the Senate by the requisite number to go on the ballot, would you favor a petition?
Would I
recall?
be talking in favor of it?
Yes.
Well, I still think it'd be up to the people to make that final decision. What I would like to see reinstituted in the state is the grand jury that was really supposed to come from the citizens and be in the local communities, so that we could, you can actually have a mechanism by which to recall some of your, or unelect some of your elected officials. Because the grand jury is supposed to be there so that people, when they see something wrong, can bring it forward to the foreman, and then the foreman would then consult with the rest and see if there's adequate evidence to be able to actually call for a jury to hear. And I'd also be in favor of having your jury no longer selected by the attorneys, but actually be a jury of your peers that is randomly selected.
Okay?
Okay.
All right. Subject change. Again, right to knows. I have written a lot of right to knows from Granite Rock lately. I find it to be a very good tool to get recalcitrant people to behave, but some of them dig in their heels.
Correct.
I'm going to give you 2 examples. The one most recently was that I wanted a copy of the non-public meeting notes from Gunstock of the GAC, along with the Zoom recording that was made. When I saw that the next meeting was going to vote to seal the records, which they probably should have done at the meeting, they didn't. So I put in a right to know in time before their next GAC meeting, and Doug Lambert, who was the, I guess, acting chair, really quashed it after, for whatever reason, the voting against was to seal the meeting notice or minutes and not bother answering the RSA, which was, in my eyes, was
It's a violation of the
It was a
law.
violation. Also, in this Dillon's Rule state, and I'm sure that you understand Home Rule versus Dillon's Rule, one of the few people I know understands that, I am suing the Guilford School Board because I put in numerous right to knows that, okay, for your policy JBAB, transgender and non-conforming, which you and I have talked about,
Right.
our various school systems, that they have refused to say where they get the power from the state legislature. Let me see if that is my wife. Hold that thought for just a second. David Strang.
Okay, we're about 13 minutes from this, from the first break.
Yeah. Where they get from their policy JBAB says, we can coerce your speech. The original language from the NHSBA was a transgender student has the right to demand that others use preferred pronouns, which then turns into coerced government speech. And they won't answer my RTK saying where they get that. because, oh, well, we don't have to answer questions. I've asked them to supply the paperwork and the discussion showing how they believe that they could do that. Same thing with the ability to have the power to lie to parents about the transgender status of their child. So it's a problem with right to knows. I understand how the politics are played, but most parents have no idea. Also, most parents do not have the financial wherewithal to bring a suit because all kinds of loopholes or machinations or outright declines of answering a right to know are given by government bodies all the time. As the chief executive of the state of New Hampshire, might there be something that you would do? And if so, could you let us know?
Certainly. I think that I'm well aware of that. In fact, there's a situation up in Dalton right now where the people have several $1,000s to comply with their right to know request for because they can now charge you for the copies. There's something that's definitely wrong with this picture, because if you are the government body and you don't want to comply, then you can turn around and make it so onerous for the person requesting the information that it no longer becomes transparent, but it becomes now this game to make it impossible for you because of the financial burden that it's putting on you. I mean, we see that frequently. So there's got to be something that can be done that turns around and is punitive to the uncooperating government agency, because it's fundamental to our transparency. This is one of the things that we have to be able to investigate. And for someone in the first place to look at a right to know request means that they've been doing some research. And, you know, people's time and efforts should be rewarded, and the government should be open and transparent. And if it's not open and transparent, then there's something else that's going on, and then there's got to be some way that we can now be punitive on that.
Follow-up is just passed into law was an RTK, right to know ombudsman.
Correct.
How would you be guiding or using that person and making it known if your local agency, whether it's a local town, local school board, whatever, or a state agency is not behaving well? How would you direct that RTK person? And I'm not sure of all of the stuff that they can do just yet, but how would you tell them to proceed?
With teeth.
Okay, how long are the fangs?
Yeah, I'm just getting familiar with this ombudsman idea, and I think it's a great one, because so many people out there who know about the RTK and want to utilize it don't know what to do when the agency doesn't comply with the 5 days or doesn't comply with the written law. What do I do now? How do I proceed? And many times the agency will ask for extended time, and when they do that, they're just stalling. And the other thing that they do frequently is you may have a request that says, I would like to have the minutes from the January 14th meeting at such and such a time. Well, your mistake, because it was actually the January 13th meeting, and so we don't have those minutes.
There are
and
no
they play those
responsive
games.
records to your
Right.
request. Because most people, once they run into this, there is in law, there is the ability to go to Superior Court, go to the head of the line, but most people are scared of the paperwork. So again, how would you grease those rails to make it
Well,
easy?
actually, the ombudsman could be then guiding the process and narrowing the process also, so it's not onerous to the average person out here.
Okay. Back to you.
we talked in terms of the bully pulpit that the governor occupies. The legislature in this past session, both houses of the Senate passed a bill that was originally crafted by Representative Paul Terry of Alton, called a Parental Bill of Rights, and it went through committees and went through amendments, etc. And when it came to the House of Representatives, it lost by less than a dozen votes in the face of statements by the sitting governor that if it passed and came to him, he would veto it. If a Parental Bill of Rights, similar to what was proposed, came to you as governor, would you sign it? Would you veto it or allow it to become law without your signature?
I'd sign it right off the bat.
Okay, thank you. And follow up a little sidebar here. You talked earlier about laws that we have where there's no enforcement mechanism, where there are restrictions on government activities, but if the government violates them, if an agency violates them or a body violates them, there's really no enforcement mechanism. So we have in New Hampshire, as a Dillon Rule state, we have a statute, an RSA. It's called the State Firearms Preemption Law, which says that all firearms regulation must be done only at the state level, not at any other lower level by municipalities, etc. Yet there are some municipalities in New Hampshire that have adopted various and sundry firearms regulations contrary to that law. But the law does not have any enforcement mechanism per se. I introduced a bill that passed the House that would have provided an extensive enforcement mechanism where any citizen who was in a municipality that had such laws could put them on notice that they had to rescind and eventually go to court if necessary. And that bill got sidetracked when it went back to the Senate. And in a committee of conference, the conferees could not agree, so the bill died. So it seems to me that, that's only one area. That's firearms preemption, but there's a lot of other areas where there are provisions in the law, restrictions that basically have no enforcement mechanism. Would you favor legislation that would provide that if the legislature has focused its attention on an issue and has voted on an issue and passed an issue and it's been signed into law, would you favor having enforcement mechanisms for these laws?
So one of the things that I think needs to happen, yes, I would favor some form, but the legislature has to do its job. So one of the things that I think they also need to pay attention to is so many times we get thousands of bills every session where we're just proposing things. And I think they need to start going through some very, very basic questions. There's only 5 of them. One of them, the first one is this provided for by the Constitution. So where in many of our agencies is there a provision for the Department of Education, for example? Where is there a provision for the Department of Environmental Services? Where is it in the Constitution that even allows it in the first place? Second, then there should be a question about, is this something that private industry could do? And these are questions that should be asked. So I think one of the things we need to do as a total body, and it's sort of a housekeeping type thing, is the first year you have of a 2-year term, you need to have the budget. So we should have that actually be the primary focus of the legislature. That first year is get that budget passed. And oh, by the way, there should not be an HB2 because the Constitution already says that HB1 is supposed to be just numbers. And so all of this Christmas tree that happens in HB2 should not be there. So but during that first year, I think one of my proposals would be that you, as the legislature, form your committees, and we know who's sitting on them. Now, go into all of the RSAs that exist today. Find out which ones are redundant. Find out which ones should have been sunsetted. Find out which ones are really not constitutional. Do some real research, and let's clean up our books first and start afresh. And then in the second year, then you can make your proposals on how do we handle these bills and how do we get rid of some of this. And let's reduce the size of our RSAs back to a reasonable set that the people can actually visit, understand, and go forward with. And in that process, then they should also be looking at, are there any enforcement mechanisms in here? And if they're not, is this a bill that we really, or is this an RSA that we really should continue to keep and therefore add the appropriate enforcement mechanism?
We're at the time.
Oh,
So this is a break time,
like 30 seconds.
30 seconds when you change batteries.
No, I just stop it from recording and then start another recording.
Oh, okay.
That's it.
Oh, okay.
That's
Because
easy.
what I'm
What-
finding is that at 2 hours, over 2 hours, the file is getting corrupted. It never gets.
Okay, so we need another hour now.
Yeah. So what time is it?
It's 7:27, 7:28.
Okay. So 7:15 would work.
8:15.
8:15.
8:15.
Yeah. All right. Well, you stole one of the thunders of my next question, which was, would you be willing to veto any laws that don't have a sunset clause? And I think you just kind of answered
Yes.
that. You would. So I've got two more. I'm going to do the last one first. Remonstrances. As you know, there has been a movement afoot to reactivate what Bill O'Brien did as he was Speaker of the House, to seek redress of your elected representatives. And the succeeding Speakers of the Houses and the President of the Senate have both fought this tooth and nail. Dan Richard, as opposed to Dan Richards,
Correct.
has been fighting this, and I've been putting them up a lot over the last couple of years. He's getting better and better at doing this. But a lot of people, after watching the New Hampshire Supreme Court Zoom meeting, and then hearing the result, basically said the fix was in. My question is to you, twofold. One, how would you apply pressure to actually activate or have the House and the Senate reactivate that basically redress of grievances committee and make it stick? And if not, even though it is not in the Constitution specifically, would you have almost an ombudsman, and I'm not quite sure what agency it would fit into, but where people have grievances that they can't otherwise get the government to hear, would you create such a function?
So I don't know that I create it because I don't want to grow government.
Yeah.
But the primary purpose of the general court, from my understanding of history, is that the very first duty that they had was to the citizens. So when the citizens came with a remonstrance or a grievance, those were the first things that should be heard by the general court when they assembled. And after that, then they can go on with other business. So I think that is something that we, from my understanding also, Chuck Douglas, in a report to the legislature, actually cited thousands of remonstrances that have been heard over the history of our state. That means to me that this is something that we should reinstitute and encourage the legislature to appropriately deal with that. And if they're not going to, they're not upholding the Constitution according to their oath, and they should be removed from office.
Ooh, yeah, that's the basis of a really good next question. So I will.
Go ahead.
Oh, oaths. We have people who do not fulfill their oaths. It's in the Constitution, Part 8? No. whatever the part of the Constitution is that outlines, there's a couple different versions of the oath in there.
Correct. Yeah.
One of which is just obey the Constitution, and the other one says obey the constitutions and all the rules and regulations of the state of New Hampshire. Everybody has to take that. We know this has been an ongoing problem for years, almost as long as Granite Rock's been around, since 2006, that people like us complain that how can you be a legislator, and refuse to honor your oath?
Correct.
What are your feelings on that? And what might you consider doing, or what you couldn't do as a sitting governor?
So one of the things that I think, especially since we have a law that says our children shall be taught in the schools from 8th through 12th grade, right? Why not also require anybody who holds their hand up and takes an oath to uphold the Constitution? Why aren't they required to demonstrate that they have a working knowledge of the Constitution before they take their oath?
But that's not in the Constitution. That's not a requirement.
That's not a requirement, but why couldn't we advocate for a requirement along those same lines? Because I would almost wager a bet on it that a good 75 to 80% of the state legislature has no idea what our Constitution says.
And I would agree with that, because I have a page on Granite Rock called The Proper Role of the Progressives and the Proper Role of Government and Your Subservience to That. And a number, mostly Democrats, but a few Republicans, have basically said, honoring the Constitution, to summarize it, it's not my job. That's up to the judiciary. And I don't care what it says. And basically are saying no. So, is it possible that when they sponsor a bill, you could say, no. This will be an automatic veto, because you cannot prove to me what it satisfies. Or, again, Dillon's rules state that you're not allowed to do this. His Norm's question about 28A certainly was a case in point when the state legislature, because of period poverty, some stupid thing like this, and we haven't gotten into the culture war yet, was all about making sure that feminine hygiene was both in the boys' and girls' bathroom, and the legislature gave no state money for that. Judy Aaron this last session, who also writes for Granite Rock, but is also a state rep, put in a bill to say it's blatantly unconstitutional, and it was shot down in the legislature. So, oh gosh, now I just lost my train of thought. It happened. So anyways, again, any more thoughts on what could you do for those people who are doing unconstitutional stupidity?
Well, I don't know that I could totally control that.
Yeah.
I mean, I can make this proposal of demonstrating constitutional knowledge and command of the Constitution itself from the bully pulpit. But part of that is educating the public that this is something that needs to be done. And oh, by the way, the public ought to be studying their Constitution so that they know their rights, and they can also know when, in fact, the legislature or a legislator is violating those rights. So, I think anytime you've got a legislator who introduces a red flag bill, for example, like Jeff Bradley, that you should actually, he should be a candidate for impeachment, because he's just violated the basic Bill of Rights of our state. And if you're going to take an oath, then you ought to be able to live up to it, and your integrity should be there. And that we need to hold our elected officials to the level of integrity that we expect.
Okay. Back to you.
Well, the general court has got 424 members, 400 in the House and 24 in the Senate.
Correct.
And trying to, whether the governor or anyone, whether it's the governor or the speaker or the president of the Senate, trying to get the members of the bodies to agree on things has been characterized as herding cats, like herding cats. Very, very difficult to do. And other than the use of the bully pulpit to say, if you pass this, I'm going to veto it, or this is something you need to pass, is there anything that you can see? I think impeachment is probably, impeachment of a member of the general court is probably a remote possibility, almost virtually impossible to do. I don't know that historically, maybe we should ask Dan Itzy whether it's ever been done. He would know. But so, other than the bully pulpit, how do you get the legislature to do the right thing? Is there an answer to that question?
You use the bully pulpit. Well, you have to apply to the public, right? And the individual, because these people actually do respond to public pressure. And so as people are educated in these areas, and if it's something that really is of importance to them, then they are going to have to get up off the sofa and go and make sure that their individual legislator hears from them and understands that there's got to be some mechanism. I'm not sure what the mechanism is going to be to force someone to actually obey their oath. There has to be something that I'm sure we can all come up with. This is the beauty of New Hampshire, is your individual ability to actually get in touch with your legislator, because we, unlike other states where there's thousands of people represented by one person, New Hampshire's down, 3,800 at this point.
Something like that.
And you can pick up the phone, you can run into them at the grocery store, you can go over and stand in front of their house. And
I've done that before, knocked on their door.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what this is the beauty of New Hampshire. This involves citizenry, and we need to highlight that, enjoy it, and make sure that everybody understands it. And then constantly, I would be calling for, have you read your Constitution lately? Do you know your rights? And if you don't know them, how can you defend them? And we have to constantly be putting that forward. And then our schools have to be teaching what is in the law, have to be abiding by what is in the law, not relying on ED 300 to set the rules and regulations.
And when you can't get the school board to follow the law, what hope is there?
Well, part of the problem with the school board is that they don't realize that they are the ones that are in charge. They seem to think that it's the superintendent that is in charge. And quite honestly, our laws and the ED 300 are contradictory. And that's something that needs to be clarified.
Different change of subject again. Pensions, the rainy day fund, and surpluses, and 401ks. We have a huge problem with pensions here in New Hampshire.
Yeah, we do.
Especially when you look at it from a per capita basis. We've got huge surpluses. We know that the Democrats always want to spend almost all of it right away. Republicans want to spend a good deal of it in one way or the other. So how do you get to the point of saying, this is a problem that's got to be solved once and for all? So I'm looking for your opinion of, when we have large surpluses, once the rainy day fund has been topped off, would you be willing to put all of the surplus against the pension backfill that is required to fully fund it, and then start using the bully pulpit once again, and I know it's not popular, especially with the public sector unions, to switch to a 401k type process, which is what the public sector does, and say, we'll contribute so much per whatever period of time, and then you get to control it, you get to do it, instead of the state doing it, and the state doesn't always do such a hot job.
Correct. I agree with you. The thing is that right now we're bankrupt. When you look at the pension situation that we're in, we've been bankrupt for years, because back when California was claiming that they were bankrupt, we were in the same situation, but nobody talks about it. And it's always, well, we're going to get these funds in, all of the funds that keep coming into this state and getting distributed and so forth, that are federal dollars. Every one of them has something that it's going to require we as the people of New Hampshire to comply with in some way, which is wrong. And so I think that we definitely need to take the funds that we have. In fact, it's like a fund balance. So when J.R. Hull found out that the school had a fund balance of $1 million, he took them to court. And thank you, J.R. Hull, for doing that, because now we have a constitutional amendment that says a taxpayer has a standing in court, because at the time he brought it, he did not have standing. And this has been used against public officials, against the citizens, the taxpayers. We ought to be able, as taxpayers, to ask for an accountability there. So the fund balance in the judge's comments said it belongs to the taxpayers. So anytime we have excess funds, they should go back to the taxpayers, and in some way to relieve them of their burden.
Okay. Follow-up question. Nashua is famous, Mayor Donchess is famous for complaining about, well, retirement costs are eating up our budget, even as he pays, he adds staff and really heightens their salaries. So it's like, all right, the rest of us are subsidizing you through the pension fund. Would you make it possible for local entities, subdivisions of the state, to say, okay, we are going to leave the retirement fund, so we control how much we would be paying for retirement rather than the state? Is that something that you would be in favor of?
Yes, because the responsibility of, so when you get a budget, thank you, Ian Underwood, when you get a budget,
yes,
you know, this is how much money I have. And Bill O'Brien did basically the same thing. This is how much money I have. This is how we are going to address the needs of the government. And the government needs are to oversee and make sure that your rights are protected and not be providing all of these other entities that really are not constitutional in the first place. Again, the government is responsible for making sure that we have, that we can conduct business across state lines, across, within our communities, between counties and that kind of thing. Government is supposed to be making sure that our roads are well taken care of, and that where bridges are safe, those sorts of things, that we've got ways to get from one place to the next to conduct business. And then government is supposed to protect the people and our sovereignty, basically. So if it's not there, and the oversight, the overhead that needs to be done in order to do those things doesn't fall into this particular agency or whatever, then that agency really shouldn't exist.
Okay.
I have some questions about.
By the way, we could use some lights now.
Okay. The pension plan, the state pension arrangements. My understanding is that the various governmental pension plans that exist in New Hampshire are what are called defined benefit plans.
Correct.
Which means that they do actuarial studies on who the participants are, they determine what their benefits are supposed to be and how long they're going to have to be paid. They assume a certain rate of return on investments, which may or may not be accurate, and then that's what they figure out is what the contributions by the government to the fund has to be. And basically following that model of the defined benefit plans. That's why we find ourselves in this fix, and many states are in fix, some worse than ours. where there are deficits, there's just not enough money, and it becomes in effect a Ponzi scheme where the current people who are contributing, that's used to pay people who are now retired.
Correct.
The alternative is what's called a defined contribution plan, like a 401k, where the government negotiates with, let's say, a public sector union, and in the collective bargaining agreement it says we're going to pay a certain percentage of your salary, and that's going to go into this defined contribution plan, and you're going to have the right to choose the investments, and you have the right to control your own plan, and it will be portable. If you move from agency to agency or school board to school board, you can take it with you, etc. You don't forfeit anything. But, and the theory that I've read is that you have people who are in the plan currently that have been promised these defined benefits. So you really can't take that away from them. But on new hires, and man, this is done often in business.
Absolutely.
New hires now become subject to a different retirement plan, which is a defined contribution plan. So that eventually, as the workforce changes and more people retire out of the workforce, more and more new people come in, all of a sudden, years down the line, we have almost entirely a defined contribution retirement system. Would you favor a defined contribution as opposed to a defined benefit plan?
Absolutely. I think there's no reason why we can't change over. The private sector does that all the time. When they find that financially they can't handle something, then they start a program that allows them to shift and make sure that happens.
Well, in fact, in the private sector, and you may or may not be aware, in the federal government has an agency called a pension benefit
guarantee.
Whatever. It's basically a government agency that private pensions are required to pay a tax to support, and that when a company that has a defined benefit plan goes bankrupt, that government agency takes over to some extent the payments that would be required under the plan. I don't believe that we in New Hampshire have such an entity. I'm not sure. I don't believe we have such an entity that protects because the government basically never goes out of business. We don't have a school board that closes its doors and says we can't pay our bills, we're going out of business. They don't do that here. That doesn't happen in state government. But in the private sector, of course, that's always a possibility. So, we have these conflicting demands for continued benefits at a high level. And it used to be that if you got employment as a government employee, you took a lower than free market rate
Correct.
of compensation in return for job stability, the likelihood you were never going to be laid off, it had good benefits, etc. But now the rates of pay at government levels have gone up so that they are many times comparable or even sometimes higher than those in the private sector.
Right.
So how do you deal with that?
So one of the things that happens many times and exists in New Hampshire, I believe, is that your last 3 years of compensation, your pay, your overtime, all of that is a factor that goes into your calculation on what your pension is going to be. If you're in the military, you have a base pay. You may have had flight pay, you may have had combat pay, you may have had all of these other things, but your pension is based on your base pay. And why can't we implement that in the state level? And there's some things that unions negotiate all the time and make it very favorable. Now, it's not going to be popular, and somebody's probably going to say, that's it, I'm not voting for her. But the reality is that we have a responsibility to the taxpayer to be good stewards of their funds, and we're not right now. We're very flippant about how our taxpayer dollars are spent.
How are we doing on time, by the way?
I got about 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay. We've we have mentioned Dillon's rule state versus home rule state.
Correct.
And for the people watching the video, home rule state basically says that a local entity, subdivision of the state, can do anything that they want as long as they don't violate state or federal law. A Dillon's rule state, which is New Hampshire, says those subdivisions of the state, school board, town, whatever, can only do those things that they can point an RSA at that enumerates what is allowed. Everything else is disallowed. Here in New Hampshire, we talk a lot about local control. And over the years, it's certainly become clear that there's very little local control. There's local control only within a little cage that has been built around it. As governor, would you prefer to be in a home rule state? And again, I'm just going to take it away from just being New Hampshire. Would you rather be a governor in a home rule state or a Dillon's rule state? Tell us what your thoughts either way or both.
Well, we really have a combination of both here in New Hampshire. Even though we advertise that we're Dillon's rule, we don't always enforce it. For example, one community can outlaw certain medical, or what are they called? Marijuana, not marijuana, but some cartoon is the one I'm thinking about. Some communities can actually outlaw the sale of those in their community. And others would be, if it's not been proposed, they're not doing anything with it one way or the other. So in adjacent communities, that would be a problem. Certainly, the problem with a home rule is that we could now put a rule in that has to apply to our firearms, which is a constitutional right, and the next community could be totally open. So you cross the border, just like when we go to Massachusetts, we're in deep trouble if you happen to forget that you're crossing the line, or if you're even unaware that you've crossed the line, you can be in a lot of trouble. Especially when it comes to our constitutionally protected Second Amendment right. I would not want to be in a home rule state.
Okay. All right. Back to you, sir.
I'm thinking.
Oh.
Is that why there's smoke coming out of his ears?
Right, yes. Smoke is rising, yes, right.
Okay. Dealing with the unions. I did teach at the local community college just after the Janus decision. I was being told before it was made that I had to join the union, and that if I didn't, I was not going to be able to lecture. And as soon as that decision came out, I told the community college administration and the department head I was not going to join the NEA. They weren't too happy about that. Maybe that's the reason why I never got asked back, although I got very good reviews. We do have, I love this, SEIU Chapter 1984 as the main public sector.
Correct.
In here. I just love that 1984. It brings up memories of a book I once read.
Seems like we're living.
Yeah, some have taken it to be a how-to instead of a warning. That's a lot different than in a lot of private sector companies. How well are you structured to be able to negotiate with a lot of unions on pay, benefits, but especially work rules?
So, my problem with the SEIU is that they coerce the funds out of their members, and much like Planned Parenthood, they tell you that we segregate everything, but in reality, all the funds are fungible, and they are known for promoting one party over the other, which is a violation, I think, of the trust of their members. So, as far as negotiating with them, I probably would not be a real popular person because I think that we should be free to make a decision about whether we want to join this organization. It's an unelected group of people, in essence, that is forcing their rules on elected people or even non-elected people. And I don't think that that's exactly what our founding fathers had envisioned when they said all men are created equal and should have equal opportunity. They're more aimed towards equal outcome, and that, I think, is a clear violation of where we're going.
Okay.
Let's talk about occupational licensing.
Good one.
That is a good one.
Occupational licensing. Up until a couple of years ago in New Hampshire, if you wanted to engage in the occupation of braiding someone's hair, you needed to have an occupational license that required many hours of cosmetology training and internships and things of that sort. And eventually that was eliminated by passing of law. But there are many occupations, still in New Hampshire, that require occupational licenses as a prerequisite in order to engage in occupations. What is your feeling about the proper role of occupational licensing? Do we have too many, not enough? Is it just right? Are there things that should be eliminated? Should there be free entry into occupations without the necessity of occupational licenses, sort of like a guild that's established? What's your view on occupational licensing?
So the prime example that I have is the Timber Association, because the Timber Association decided that we need to train our people so that they are safe and effective. And they did that on their own. They didn't have a government agency reaching over and saying, this is how you have to do it. So I really believe that our government has far more tentacles than they need to have. And so when it comes to occupational licensing, I think it really should be up to the vocation itself to set those rules amongst themselves and then advertise it to the public so that the public now knows that this particular business has our approval or doesn't have our approval. And it should be more up to the individual vocations to make those decisions.
As a follow-up, it was sort of interesting. I found it interesting that if you want to build a house or an office building or a shopping center in New Hampshire, you can hire a general contractor who then hires the different trades. You don't have to have an occupational license to be a carpenter, but you do have to have an occupational license to be a plumber, and you have to have an occupational license to be an electrician, and you have to have an occupational license to be a gas fitter, but not as a carpenter, and not as a steel worker, and not as a general contractor. It seems to me that there's some lack of consistency in the application of the philosophy of requiring occupational licensing to, as they say, in quotes, protect the public. And I just want to once again try to elicit some views of your views, like in the construction business. Some of the stuff doesn't make any sense. Right?
No, it doesn't make any sense, and yes, the reason that the government got involved was for the safety of the people. And what did Benjamin Franklin say? But you give up a little bit of freedom for safety, and you have neither. Right. And so there are many examples, I think, where it should be up to the individual family or whatever to make those decisions. I mean, you can't go. One of the other areas is the optician, right? You cannot get your prescription refilled if you haven't been to the optician for 2 years in a row. Even though your eyes may not have changed, you just want to have a new pair of glasses, you have to go through the whole process again, which is lining somebody's pockets with some funds, in my opinion. So I think that here again, we have to assess whether or not it is really that important for government to be involved in this, or is this something that the people should be responsible for, the individual companies, the individual occupations.
Well, as a follow-up, there's another area that I'm very familiar with regarding sort of occupational licensing. In New Hampshire, in order to practice law for the safety of the public, a person who has to graduate from an accredited law school, and then they have to take a bar examination and an examination on ethical responsibilities. And then they get sworn in. But the entire process is called, New Hampshire has what's called an integrated bar, which means that in order to practice law, aside from doing all of those required steps, you must actually belong to and pay membership dues to the New Hampshire Bar Association, which, separate and apart from the conduct committees that do investigate possible misdeeds and things like that. So you have to pay dues to the New Hampshire Bar Association. In some states, which don't have an integrated bar, you have the same steps to become admitted to practice, to get a license to practice. You take the bar exam, you pass the bar exam, you get sworn in, but you don't have to belong to the statewide bar association. They're called voluntary bars. There could be a local, could be a countywide, could be a statewide, but it's voluntary. But we have an integrated bar, so you have to belong. And I'm not sure whether, I haven't really studied whether the New Hampshire Bar Association makes political contributions or not. I don't know. In some states that have an integrated bar, they allow members to notify the bar that they don't want any portion of their dues to go to any political contributions. They have to be segregated. But like you said before in another context, dollars are fungible. So would you favor making the practice of law deregulated from an integrated bar into a voluntary bar?
So isn't that, the integrated bar sounds to me like a union and forced union dues. So is that not a violation of the Janus rule?
Well, the way that has to be, the only way to determine that is that someone has to hire a lawyer and pay a lawyer and pay lawyers to go through the whole process and probably end up in federal court. And there is a saying that I've always heard is don't make a federal case out of it, because federal court litigation is very expensive. So there are a few liberty-oriented law firms that are supported privately that will take on public interest type of litigation. But to try to challenge, for example, the notion of integrated bar is a very difficult lift for anyone to do. It's very difficult and expensive for them to do. So some people would say it's like a union, it's like a guild. Sure, maybe. I don't know that anyone has challenged it. I would be surprised if somewhere in the country someone has not already challenged the integrated bar when they have had integrated bars, and they seem to be upheld by the courts, unfortunately.
Right.
But basically, you have no choice. If you want to practice the profession, you must pay dues to the integrated bar.
And unfortunately, it's punitive in the state of New Hampshire if you go up against the Bar Association in any way. If you want to uphold the citizens' right to a remonstrance and a grievance, then by all means, the New Hampshire Bar Association has been known to find something wrong that you were doing professionally and punitive and punish you for it. And so it's very, very hard in the state of New Hampshire to find anybody, by any citizen, not necessarily even a lawyer, to actually take a case that is going to challenge what is going on here.
In fact, I will point out that we've got about 10 minutes more.
Okay.
My proposed constitutional amendment to allow for petition recall of state court judges in the committee of the House to which it was assigned, a representative of the New Hampshire Bar Association appeared and testified in opposition to that notion. And they said that was the position of the executive board of the New Hampshire Bar Association.
Right.
They never took, and in fact I think there was a letter in the New Hampshire Bar News that someone complained, well, we never had a vote of all the members of the bar, whether they were in favor of this or not, but the bar stated their position as opposed to citizen petition recalls of judges.
Yeah.
So it does happen, it does occur. They do take political positions.
Right. Oh, very definitely they do.
Yeah.
Two quick questions. One, the news has come up. This has come up a few years ago, when we found that federal agencies were all becoming Rambo SWAT teams and buying enormous amounts of weaponry and rounds. The IRS was just reported to have bought 5 million rounds of ammo. Do you know of any agencies within the state government, other than the state police and the National Guard, that is a little alarming?
I'm not aware of any, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist.
Okay. And then the last question that I'm going to have, because we are drawing to a close, we have seen controversy come up twice. Greenwich Rock was the one that broke the news on the $500 contribution by Tom Day, who was the general manager of Gunstock, using Gunstock Area Commission checks to make a political donation to the Sununu candidacy, your opposition.
Mm-hmm.
And both of them, I've already skewered what Tom Day said. No, they're not a for-profit entity, although that's part of the reason why there's so much of an issue right now around Gunstock. But that the donation was simply to promote Gunstock. Well, it certainly was, but I'm betting it runs afoul of election law. And now Kevin Landrigan just broke the story that there's a $1,000 one that was sent out in June. If a bill came before you, would you sign it that says no subdivision of the state can give a political contribution to any elected officer within state government?
Yes, because I first of all, why are you since Gunstock is owned by the county, that means that those are taxpayer dollars.
Oh, but they keep saying it's not taxpayer dollars.
Well, even if it isn't the taxpayer dollars, it is under the auspices of the county, and the elected representatives are the oversight committee for that. So how do you now say it's okay to coerce those taxpayers to pay for something that they haven't had a voice in? The other thing, I mean, this is akin to our dollars that go to non-governmental agencies, even if they are nonprofits. The fact that we are taking taxpayer dollars and not just operating the state government, but also contributing to other entities that should be, in fact, up to you, the taxpayer, to make that decision. This is reminiscent of Davy Crockett, right? When he was out campaigning and the farmer said, "I'll never donate to you again," and he inquired as to why. And the farmer said, "You took my dollars and gave them to a widow when it wasn't your place to do that. If I wanted to donate to that widow to help her out because she had an unfortunate situation occur, that's my responsibility." And too often in state government and even in local government, we coerce the dollars out of the taxpayer to make them pay for things that the taxpayer may not even support. Prime example is all of those dollars that the governor wants to spend on Planned Parenthood.
Correct. Okay, last question.
I'm done.
All right, one last question for me that I'm asking everybody, no matter what the race is. Too often, when people go down to Concord or they go down to Washington, D.C., they become co-opted one way or the other. My question to you is, do you already have what is informally known as either a kitchen cabinet of people that you would surround yourself, or, I'd like to put it better, people who are willing to scream at you if you do the wrong thing for the wrong purpose, to keep you on the straight and narrow? Have you assembled such a collection of either friends or people that you respect that will tell you and are unafraid to tell you, you screwball, you should not be doing this, or why the heck did you do that? Why aren't you doing this other thing? Because it comports with conservative values.
Absolutely, yes.
You have one?
I have a group of people that will hold me accountable.
Okay.
In addition to the fact that I am saying to, on the campaign trail, reminding our citizenry that that's their responsibility as well. That once you cast that vote, that's not the end of your responsibility. Your responsibility is also to keep an eye on what's going on. And that's a decision each one of us has to make if we are going to keep the constitutional republic that we have.
Well, Karen, Testerman, not Thurston, but Testerman.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you very much, not for spending just a few minutes with Granite Rock, or moments when we do our micro interviews, but thank you for spending 2 whole hours with Granite Rock. And as you can tell, we came ready to grill you, and we thank you for your time, because we know that you didn't have to appear. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for asking all those questions.
You're quite welcome. It's always a lot of fun.
Yeah.
All right, we are done.
Good.
Croc TV.